So this week we are taking a closer look at deductive arguments. So just to do a rundown, since the beginning of the course, we started off with what's an argument, what's a premise, what's a conclusion, what are the indicator words for premises and conclusions, what's the difference between deduction and induction, and then we learned about how to evaluate deductive arguments in terms of validity and soundness, right? And then we went over how to evaluate inductive arguments in terms of strength and cogency. And we're going to be moving on to taking a closer look at deductive arguments. Now, remember that there's a few different forms of deductive arguments that we took a look at. We had math, right? Definition. And then there were the three types of syllogisms, which were categorical, disjunctive, and hypothetical, right? So this week we are looking at how to determine validity in hypothetical syllogisms only, right? Those are the if-then syllogisms, and a syllogism has two premises, one conclusion. Right? And there are some formulas. As long as you know how to inspect or can figure out how to inspect the form of a hypothetical syllogism, you can apply a formula to it and figure out whether it's valid or invalid. Okay. So, a hypothetical syllogism has a hypothetical, or otherwise known as a conditional statement, as one of its premises. A conditional statement or a hypothetical statement, those are interchangeable words for our purposes, is an if-then statement, right? If X, then Y, for instance. So whatever is stated in the X position is known as the antecedent. And whatever is stated in the Y position is known as the consequent. Now, here's some examples of hypothetical syllogisms, right? If it is raining, then the ground is wet. So if X, then Y, right? It is raining, so then this is just like X. Therefore, the ground is wet, and this is just like Y. Okay, or if it is raining, then the ground is wet. So again, if X, then Y. The ground is not wet, so not Y. Therefore, it is not raining, so not X. Okay, so in each of these hypothetical syllogisms, the antecedent is it is raining, and the consequent is the ground is wet. Those are the X's and Y's of the matter for this particular instance. Now, we can easily determine whether a hypothetical syllogism is valid or invalid by simply inspecting its form, like I said before, right? So hang with me for this. Validity in a hypothetical syllogism is dependent upon whether the premise or the premises are affirming or denying the antecedent or the consequent of the conditional statement. Now, that seems a little complex, right? Because we're just starting to use this vocabulary, but just bear, we're going to play this out with some examples, right? So carefully inspect the chart on the next slide, and I posted this chart for you to use as well, or a chart that's very similar to it. The valid and invalid forms of hypothetical syllogisms are presented there, and they each have names. And this is going to be important for your homework. It'll be important for your quiz number 3. So you have to know these or have access to them in the chart. So first, there's the two valid forms of hypothetical syllogism are known as modus ponens and modus tollens. Okay? So for modus ponens, the form goes like this. If X, then Y. And then you're affirming X in order to conclude with affirming Y. No matter what you plug in for X and Y, always valid and known as modus ponens. Or there's modus tollens. If you got X, then you got Y. And then you don't have Y, not Y, which is denying the Y. Therefore, you don't have X. You're denying the X. Okay, that's known as modus tollens again. These two are the valid forms of hypothetical syllogism. And then there are two corresponding invalid forms, right? Those are known as affirming the consequent and denying the antecedent. So let's take a look. Affirming the consequent. If X, then Y. Well, you got Y, so you're affirming or saying yes to Y, which is the consequent. Therefore, you got X. Always invalid no matter what you plug in for X and Y. And then down here, denying the antecedent. If X, then Y. Well, you don't have X, right? You're denying the antecedent. Therefore, you don't have Y. Always invalid. No matter what you plug in for X and Y. I can't stress that enough. So, again, to wrap that up, the valid forms of hypothetical syllogisms are known as modus ponens, which is Latin for affirming mode, and modus tollens, which is Latin for denying mode. The invalid forms of hypothetical syllogisms are known as affirming the consequent and denying the antecedent. So this means that, once again, no matter what is plugged in for X and Y in the conditional statement of a hypothetical syllogism, the validity of the syllogism depends upon whether the second premise is affirming or denying the antecedent or the consequent of that conditional statement. So let's plug in some real values for X and Y here, right? If it is raining, then the ground is wet, right? So this is saying under the condition that you got rain, you know you're going to get wet ground. And this is saying, well, you do have rain. Therefore, you got wet ground, right? If X, then Y. X, therefore, Y. Modus ponens, always valid. Remember, it doesn't, if you are trying to figure out whether or not these are true or false statements, then you are missing the point here, right? Because truth and falsity, real truth and falsity, is a matter of soundness. Validity is about form. That's how come just by inspecting the form of the argument, you can figure out whether it's valid or not. And that's all we're doing for this section. So then down here, if it is raining, X, then the ground is wet, Y. Well, the ground is not wet, not Y. Therefore, not X, valid, modus tollens. Okay, and then over here, the invalid forms. If it is raining, then the ground is wet. Again, same stuff. If X, then Y. Well, the ground is wet, so you're saying yes to X. Therefore, I'm sorry. You're saying yes to Y. Therefore, it's raining. Always invalid, right? No matter what. And you can just kind of make sense of this in your own mind. The first statement is saying, under the condition that you got rain, then you've got wet ground. Well, we know you've got wet ground. Does it follow necessarily that it's raining? No, the ground could have been wet because the hydrant was broken or a sprinkler was broken, right? So although this conclusion may follow probably or likely, it doesn't follow necessarily, and that's what you need for deductive validity, okay? That's affirming the consequent. Or down here, if it's raining, then the ground is wet. and it's not raining, therefore the ground is not wet. No matter what, notice here you are denying the antecedent, right? If it comes in this form, a hypothetical syllogism, always invalid. For the same basic reasons if you were to think it out as the above example, affirming the consequent. Okay, let's do some examples with answers. And for the first several slides, I'll write on the screen with the X's and Y's. So note, so the arguments won't necessarily be presented in standard form, meaning the if-then statement, and then the second premise, and then the conclusion. So the first few of them will be presented that way, but then they'll be mixed up. So you got to make sure you're identifying the premises and the conclusion properly in each example in order to apply those formulas properly, right? If you mistake a premise for a conclusion or vice versa, and then you look at those formulas, you're going to get a wrong answer. Okay, or you may. Okay, so you use your indicator words for this. So let's go. If John is a freshman at State College, then he's a student. Well, John is not a freshman at State College, therefore he is not a student. Okay, so I'm going to break this one down pretty good. So if X, then Y. And then here, in the second premise, you have not, because notice this, not X, therefore not Y. So if you were to put this in the form of those formulas on the chart, you'd have, again, if X, then Y. Not X, therefore not Y. And then you look at your chart and you see that that corresponds to the invalid form known as denying the antecedent. So you are denying the antecedent here, right? Okay. So next, if Jessica's a teacher at Cuyamaca, then she has passed a background check. Well, Jessica is a teacher at Cuyamaca, so she must have passed a background check. So we've got if X, then Y. So here is your X, here is your Y. And then the second premise says, well, indeed, Jessica is a teacher at Cuyamaca. X, therefore Y, right? If X, then Y, X, therefore Y. Then you look at your chart and you say, okay, that corresponds to a valid form. The valid form is modus ponens. So you'd say this is valid because of modus ponens. Okay. If you smoked crack, then you broke the law. And then you've got, well, you broke the law, therefore you smoked crack. So this is going if X, then Y. Well, you got Y, therefore you got X. That's what this is saying, right? So you look at your chart once again and say, hey, this corresponds to the affirming or saying yes to the consequent, right? Always invalid. And then let's do it again. If you smoked crack, then you broke the law. And you didn't break the law, so not Y. Therefore, you didn't smoke crack. Right? If X, then Y, not Y, therefore not X. And then you look, you say, hey, that is coming at me in the modus tollens form, which is a valid form. So you'd say valid modus tollens. So I'll write on a few more slides simply because now it looks like the arguments or the examples are scrambled. And scrambled just means, I mean, you still only have 3 propositions to deal with, 2 premises and 1 conclusion. So find your conclusion first, or if it helps, just find your if-then statement, right? If your gas tank is empty, then your car won't start. So if X, right, then Y. And then this is your second premise is saying your car won't start. Why? Your conclusion is your gas tank must be empty. Right? So let me just stop for a second here, right? I'm erasing. Okay, because I don't want to take it for granted that we caught that. Starting from scratch, this is an indicator word, right? Because it's an indicator word. It's strictly a premise indicator, right? But if you have a statement in front of a premise indicator, that means you got your conclusion, okay? So the conclusion is your gas tank must be empty. And then you say, because why? Well, because your car won't start. And if your gas tank is empty, then your car won't start. So the way you put this back into proper form, it would be like this. If your gas tank is empty, then your car won't start, is your first premise. Second premise is your car won't start. And I'll send the conclusion over here. Well, the conclusion's right here. Therefore, your gas tank must be empty, right? So that's unscrambling it and putting it in the form where you got your 2 premises and then your conclusion. Okay. Oops. Darn it. All right. This is new technology for me, everybody, so hang in there. I thought it might be helpful, but I'm just learning how to use it. Man. Okay. Here we go. Okay. All right, now let's get to work. So if your gas tank is empty, is your X. Wait, your gas tank is empty, is your X. Your car won't start, is your Y. Right? Then second premise, your car won't start. Therefore, your gas tank must be empty. X. So this one's going, if X, then Y. Y, therefore, X. And then you check, what's the form? That's an invalid form known as affirming the consequent. So you'd say invalid, affirming the consequent. Okay. There is no beef stock in this soup, so it must be vegetarian, since if there is beef stock in this soup, then it is not vegetarian. Okay, so this one's scrambled. First, find your indicators to unscramble. You got an indicator here and an indicator here. This is a conclusion indicator. This is a premise indicator, right? So your conclusion is it must be vegetarian. Okay? And then your premise is the if-then statement and the other statement, right? Always 2 premises and 1 conclusion. So you've got, if there is beef stock in this soup, then it is not vegetarian, okay? And then this is saying, well, there's no beef stock in this soup, therefore it must be vegetarian. Now, what's important here is because you've got all these funky knots in there, it could throw you off. But don't let it. It's the fallacies name or the invalid forms names, they're named after what the other premise is doing, right? So if X, then Y, and then you're denying the antecedent in order to deny the consequent, right? And denying, if you say not V, that just means V. And I know I snuck V in there instead of Y, but hopefully you get the point here. Okay. So I'm going to start moving through these a little more quickly. This soup must not be vegetarian because if there is beef stock in it, then it is not vegetarian and it has beef stock in it. Okay? So this one is going, if X, then Y, X, therefore Y. Right? Keeping in mind that this is your conclusion here. The other two statements are premises. So this is valid modus ponens. Okay? If Shamu is a killer whale, then Shamu is a mammal. So, which is a conclusion indicator, Shamu must not be a killer whale since Shamu isn't a mammal. Okay? So here, that's your conclusion, right? So let's go, if X, then Y, right? Not Y, therefore not X, valid form, modus tollens. Okay, Shamu must be a killer whale because if Shamu is a killer whale, then Shamu is a mammal and Shamu is a mammal. This is your conclusion. Oops. Sorry. This is your conclusion. So you've got, if Shamu is a killer whale, then Shamu is a mammal. Shamu is a mammal, therefore Shamu is a killer whale. Invalid form known as affirming the consequent. Big Ben must be in Europe because it's in London. If it's in London, it's in Europe. Here's your conclusion. Here's your first statement. I'll just fill it in. Here's your X and your Y. And here's your X and your Y. Okay? So this is going, if X, then Y. X, therefore Y. Valid modus ponens. So hopefully the writing helped and didn't distract you much. I'll get better with it as we go along, but topics covered are validity and invalidity and hypothetical syllogisms, which means modus ponens and modus tollens for the valid forms, right? And affirming the consequent and denying the antecedent for the invalid forms.